All right, welcome to Marathon 89. In this video, we have a story from the Pacific Northwest. We have a story from my hometown, close to Memphis, Tennessee. And the last story in this set is a story of the Australian Bigfoot that tracks a Australian military recon unit for 4 days while training in the Blue Mountains in Australia. And I think you're going to find this fascinating. So let me shut my mouth and let's get rolling with this video. All right, here we go. I have had 3 separate experiences with these creatures in 64 years. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest. I lived in Seattle, but I spent most of my life camping and fishing in the woods surrounding a town, now a city, called Seattle. I was highly involved in scouting and hunting, and then later teaching the youth of our town outdoor survival skills. I did this well into my late 50s until my health dictated my place in the woods would no longer benefit the kids' experience. The first time I was to come across a Sasquatch was during a hunting trip in 1972. I was 18. It was in the foothills of Raymond, Washington during Christmas vacation. My father was born in Bremerton and had grown up on a farm and knew as much about the forests as any man I've ever known. I was his first son of a second marriage. He had come back from the war with all the scars of any vet, but he refused to let them hold him down. On this day, I was with my best friend Paul and his father Ray. The weather was cold and it was snowing. Paul was my age and Ray, his father, was in his 60s and he was in great shape. Paul and I drove to the farmhouse and we got there about 3 in the afternoon. It was cold and wet. It had been raining for days. Not unusual for that part of the country. At 3:30, we went over to the farmhouse and talked to his dad, and he told us to be real careful because there had been some hotheads making trouble in the area. We went back to our little cabin and we went to bed. Friday morning, we were up early. Paul's mom had a country breakfast set out for us that would have fed us and most of our senior class. And then we waddled outside to find 3 inches of freshly fallen light fluffy snow on the ground. This was a new twist for me. I'd never hunted in the snow, and I imagine Paul must have figured the same because his first words were, "Hey Dad, how's this supposed to work now?" Ray laughed at both of us. We spent the next 2 hours waiting for the weather to break, but it never did, so at 8:30 we were headed out. There wasn't a sound to be heard anywhere. It was dead silent except for the crunch of our boots in the snow. Hiking in the snow after eating all that food made a difficult uphill walk even harder. But Paul's father, Ray, had no trouble at all. Again, the man was in exceptional shape. He went up that hill like a mountain goat and was soon way ahead of us. At the top of the hill, he asked us if we had seen anything while coming up. I smiled at him. I said, "Yes, sir, I saw my feet." He said, "No, that's not what I meant." He held his finger up and he whispered for us to listen. I noticed the forest was no longer silent. In fact, I heard snapping and banging and cracking and thumping, anything but quiet, and there was particularly a strong skunk odor all around us. I opened my mouth to ask what it was, and he shushed me. Ray had seen a large 2-legged individual, maybe 10 feet tall, quickly running up the mountain. It was dragging a deer by its leg. The deer was missing its head. The thing had been moving below us, and that is why he started climbing so fast, hoping that we would follow along. Paul and I were perplexed, and we walked in silence all the way back to the farmhouse down a service road away from the path that we had climbed the hill. When we got back to the house, Ray made a phone call. I don't know who he talked to, but he was relaying the event to someone local. Apparently the thing had been sighted a few times in the preceding days. I was 18 at the time. I didn't see anything, but I believed it was real. I know Paul believes it was real too. And I know Ray, who is no longer with us, definitely believed it was real because he actually saw it. Strangely, two 18-year-old boys had no wish to go out and rattle the bushes with a Bigfoot out there. I didn't want to see or hear anything like this again. Ray told us that the Indians in the area call them Sasquatch. I thought this would have been a once-in-a-lifetime event. I would not be so lucky. A few years later, I was hunting with Paul and another buddy named Mike, again in the Raymond-Menlo area. We were hunting for Roosevelt elk. We all had bull tags and spent 2 days before opening day to scout, and we had found the elk. We had cow tags as well, so our chances of success were good. The bull would take some work, and if we didn't find them again, we were still legal to kill a cow. Paul and I were in our 30s at this time and feeling pretty cocky. Mike was a bit younger than us, and he was really full of himself. The great white hunter kind of guy. He was a real nice guy normally, but the more we spent showing him the ropes, the more ego he flaunted. The next morning, we headed for the field. We got there before sunup, and we waited. Everything was quiet, freakishly quiet. We should have been hearing birds or something. A few minutes before sunrise, wood knocking started in the distance. These were the exact sounds I'd heard when I was 18 with Paul and his father. And then the knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. It was light enough now to see, and I could hear a rumbling sound, like a stampede of cattle. When the Roosevelt elk are on the move in large numbers, it can be loud. The elk can weigh in at 2,500 pounds. They're really big animals. We think there were at least 200 elk in this herd, and they were coming right at us. There was nothing we could do, so we sat tight. Although it was light enough to see close in, we never saw the herd move past us, but they rumbled over each side of our position, just out of sight. As the noise faded behind us, I looked back to the area in front of us. Standing there in the dim morning light was a giant creature. Very tall and massive in size, he was silhouetted against the trees. It was the most amazing thing I had ever seen in my life, and over its shoulder draped a big bull elk. I could see the rack of the creature dangling behind the Bigfoot. I couldn't believe it. As if this morning could not have gotten more strange, this animal looked right at me, and I swear he nodded at me like he knew me, like he remembered me from 16 years ago. The Sasquatch just stood there for a moment less than 50 yards away. I focused in on its eyes, and there was no anger or fear. This sounds crazy, but I believe he wanted us to see him, to see what he was and what he was doing. And then, just as quickly, he turned, walked into the trees, and ran up the hill with that bull elk on his back with no effort at all. Neither one of us ever thought about raising our rifles. It was a very strange moment. The forest remained quiet for the most part. After that, neither one of us really had anything to say to each other, so we walked in silence. About halfway back to the farmhouse, Mike came up to us and said he hadn't seen a thing all morning. He'd gone off on his own to hunt that morning, and I was thankful that he had. We started hearing that odd banging again. Mike was a bit surprised at the noises and asked us what it was. It was full daylight now, albeit still foggy and overcast, and we kept heading back to the camp with Mike lagging behind. We told him about what we had seen. We described the creature running up the hill with the bull elk over its shoulder. Suddenly, he was all set to go hunt the Sasquatch. I told him that he was an idiot, and we kept moving back to the farmhouse with him lagging further behind. We got back to the farmhouse, and Mike got all of his gear together, and he left. We were not far behind, and the week was over. That would be my last hunting trip. I thought that if Sasquatch is a sentient being, if he's capable of viable thought, then how could he not resent us? I began to believe that we owed whatever Sasquatch might be a better shot at life than we were giving him, and from that point on I became a non-hunter. I was curious, I was scared of it, and I sensed that it was scared of me, but there was no threat. It was better not to provoke an encounter like that again, so I stayed out of the woods. My boys joined the Boy Scouts, and soon all of their friends learned I magically knew all kinds of outdoor skills, and I became the cool dad. Soon we were headed into the woods to learn the controlled camping skills involved with scouting, and for the very first time in about 5 years, I found myself really enjoying the woods again. I truly became the child I once was and honestly forgot most of my fears. I had been through backwoods survival courses, so there wasn't much I had not experienced when I was young. The scout troop progressed, and it wasn't long before we had 17 boys digging snow caves at Paradise on Mount Rainier and doing 50-mile cross-country skiing overnights. The kids had learned well, and we had absolutely no medical incidents ever. What I was most proud of, though, was they all had extreme respect for what they were doing. In scouting, at the time, the big pitch was leave no trace, and they really practiced it on every outing. When we left, the snow caves were knocked down and flattened, or the tent sites were combed over with cedar branches. We used gas stoves, so there was never an open fire. Latrines were proper cat holes and buried. We were invited to search and rescue demonstrations so other scout units could learn from our procedures. 17 youth participants on a backwoods team was unusual, but they made an exception for us because of our proficiency. I was proud of these boys, and I felt a sense of accomplishment that I had taught them these skills. I had turned my back on my outdoor experiences and figured it was something that I was just going to walk away from and have to live with it. When that Sasquatch had turned and looked at me and then ran up that hill, I made a decision that day, and I never realized it. I had decided that these woods were his home. We humans simply take what we want and we destroy everything we touch, and he had every right in the world to question what I was doing there. With all the running around in the woods we'd been doing over the past 3 years, I never once remembered hearing the banging of wood. I suppose I had forgotten about its significance. One night after dinner, while the boys were cleaning up, I asked if any of them had heard the sounds of banging or clacking wood. They all said, "Sure, Mr. B," very matter-of-factly. "It's the Sasquatch sending messages." You have no idea how surprised I was. I asked them how they knew. The youngest scout in the troop said, "They're making sure their clan knows that we're all here and they can go and do what they want now that we're all settled down." Then I asked who told them about this, and they said that they had figured it out on their own. In all the times they had been in the woods, the sounds had always been there, and try as they might, no one had ever seen one. But every night the sounds were always there, and the boys heard them. The boys actually felt safer having them. It was at that point that I decided not to tell them my story. And that's the end of his email. I just thought that was so cool. Here's an encounter from my hometown. I really enjoyed reading this. The writer's name is Dave, and here's what he says. "I'm 63 years old, and I was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. At age 7, we moved from Midtown at Vance and Pasadena to an unincorporated area called Whitehaven, which is very far south in Memphis. It is as far south as you can get without being in Mississippi. The area is now part of Memphis proper. Back in those days, it was all new construction. Old growth forest was being cut to clear the way for new homes. I can still remember climbing over huge trees less than a quarter of a mile from our new home that had been felled to make way for construction. 4 or 5 years later, as a Boy Scout, we would sometimes hike to McKellar Park from our sponsoring church on Shelby Drive about a quarter mile from Mill Branch Road for a day camp and to McKellar Park to get a required 5-mile round-trip hike under our belts. It was just us younger boys and a 16-year-old to supervise. No adults. McKellar Park is not to be confused with McKellar Lake, which feeds into the Mississippi River several miles to the west. McKellar Park was about a mile east of Interstate 55, south of Holmes Road, and north of the state line of Mississippi. It is not there anymore. The scouts, being the 11 to 14-year-old boys we were, would of course explore the area. We found what at the time we figured was a hobo shelter, but what I now know I would have recognized as a Bigfoot structure. Small trees twisted and ripped to form a low crawl-in type shelter covered with leaves and small branches. Being good scouts and true to the code and thinking that it may have been a hobo home, we left it alone and we didn't disturb it. There were times when we would have small rocks land near our day camp, and we would think that it was other scouts in our troop being jerks, but we never saw anyone, and the older boy that was with us after going to take a look assured us that everything was okay. We didn't think much about it since it only happened a few times. The rock throwing would also happen on trails and at Camp Kaikima in the Ozarks near Hardy, Arkansas. Again, we didn't think much of it except to yell into the woods and throw rocks back. In retrospect, if it had been the other boys throwing rocks at us, I'm sure our rock throwing would have incited a charge out of the woods and a scuffle with the other boys. Later in life, though, I would finally see a Bigfoot. It was back in the old neighborhood in Whitehaven. The area was just west of McKellar Park in a subdivision called Holmesdale. This is only about 1 mile east of the aforementioned McKellar Park. Again, the area was old-growth Delta forest and was being cleared for home building. There was a wooded area just east of Hudgens, which was the first surface road east of I-55. There weren't many houses yet. It was just mainly thick, open bottomland timber. I was 18, and I had taken my girlfriend on a motorcycle ride into the area. It was late afternoon, but the sun was still up pretty good. There was a trail that led just off the road to the woods with a grass buffer between the road and the woods. My bike was a touring rig, but I could easily handle trails with no problem. We went into that wooded area for some alone time, if you know what I mean. I knew that I had to get her home, and she lived all the way in Westwood, which was about 10 miles away on the other side of Highway 61. I knew we should travel while it was plenty light because there were almost no street lights on the route that we would take back, so I suggested that we head back to her place. She hopped on the back and I slowly negotiated my bike along the trail back to Hudgens Road. I was, of course, paying most of my attention to the trail, but I was watching left and right as I drove. Suddenly, to my right, I saw a white, completely hair-covered creature approximately 5 to 6 feet tall move from where we had just been and head to the north about 30 or 40 feet and then duck back into the woods. It moved very quickly, and it walked upright with its arms to its side. I didn't see any facial features, but I know it had no muzzle like a bear or a dog. I know what a bear looks like, and this was not a bear. The sighting was only about 2 seconds or so. It may have been visible longer, but I remember I was also negotiating the trail back to the road. When we got her to her home and were dismounting the bike, she took off her helmet and she asked me, "Did you see that white thing in the woods as we were leaving?" I told her that I did, and she asked, "What was that? Was that a Bigfoot?" I said I wasn't sure what it was, but it could not have been a Bigfoot because they're only found in California, Oregon, and Washington. And besides, Bigfoots are only dark brown or black. Well, now I know better. What we had seen was a small, white Sasquatch. We didn't talk about it after that. We never went back to that same spot. I wish I knew what I know now about Bigfoot. I may have gone back looking for it. Today, I live in northern Colorado, and I can clearly see the Rockies just a few miles away from the balcony of my apartment. Well, this is my story. I hope it encourages others that have had sightings in that area to come forward, especially if the critter was white. It may be the same one I saw. Respectfully submitted, Dave. Dave, that's pretty cool. And being from Memphis, I know where all that stuff is. And thanks for that. I would have had no idea there was a Bigfoot close to Memphis, especially when I was your age back in those days. But it was awesome, and I really appreciate you, buddy. Thanks. Okay, here is a Yowie encounter from Australia that was sent to me by Yeti Dan. He has actually sent me a couple of these. And what these are reports that are found on a website called yowiehunters.net. I'll link the website in the description below. Most of these encounters that you can find on yowiehunters.net are every bit as exciting and interesting as any of the websites that you can find these encounters on in North America. And I don't normally pull stories off of these websites. I know other channels do. They just read BFRO encounters and stuff. And that's fine. That's not a big deal. But I don't normally do that. Matter of fact, I've never done that. But I'm going to make an exception with this one. And I'm going to give you a link to their website. And you can browse around. So hopefully I'm driving a little traffic their way. But this was such an interesting encounter that Yeti Dan sent me that I just felt like you would really enjoy it and maybe get hooked on yowiehunters.net. So let me read you the report and sit back because this is really interesting. The date was 1989. The incident occurred in Chinaman's Gully in the Blue Mountains of Australia. It was a military training exercise. Peter was an explosives expert performing guerrilla warfare training with the 4th Battalion SAS. The group came in contact with a Yowie during exercises and were sworn to secrecy by the military hierarchy and ordered not to mention the event to other soldiers. And here's the way Peter describes their 4-day encounter with an Australian Bigfoot. We were sent in at night. It was raining. We had ghillie suits, not like the new stuff. It was the green and brown camo strips, and to get the shine off them, you rolled in the mud and got into that awful smelling crap, and the idea was that you became one with the ground. You didn't have aftershave or deodorant on. You had to smell of the bush, and that's what we did. We got dropped off down by a river down along the bottom. We were given mud maps, just a general outline to the next meeting point. They would leave a bag on a tree, and that was our next target. And there were some resistance fighters who would leave us clues to our next target. We had enough food, and we'd live off the land. There were 3 to a group, and we were aware of groups of other commandos out there trying to capture us. And then we would become prisoners of war and tortured and all of that stuff. We decided not to go the way the mud map told us to go because they would know where we would be. We decided to go a little bit further out of our way to get to our point. It was a higher road we had to go to, so we thought we'd go along the river a bit and cross country up through some gullies, through Chinaman's Gully. It was right off of the chart. Nobody goes in there. There's no bush tracks or anything. We went in there real stealthy. We did 1,000 meters in 2 hours. We did it with the sides of your foot going to the ground, and you'd roll your foot in so it makes no noise at all. And you go very, very slow. 2 other guys with me had SLRs, and we took a 60. I'm 6'4.5" and was built like a brick dunny, so I was the gunner. So what happened was we'd come through the ruined castle down the creek to the bottom, and the smell was like something had died in there. It woofed. We could not believe the smell. One of the guys with us was half caste. He looked horrified. We thought it was a cow or a horse that had died. We came to a sandstone escarpment in an easterly direction, and there was a 100-meter clearing or down timber. We were going through the open area. We'd surveyed the area and couldn't see anything. Halfway across, I propped, and the other 2 blokes propped behind me, and I just saw a head pop up behind a downed gum tree about 15 to 20 meters away. I saw the head and it was all matted and that, and I thought, oh, that's another ghillie suit, right? And we've walked into an ambush. They've got the higher ground and we had the lower ground, and we were stuffed in the open with nowhere to go. And then a mate came up behind me and he was shaking. I said, what's wrong with you? He said, that's not one of us. And I said, what do you mean that's not one of us? He said, that thing is big. So we watched it and it just grew out of the ground. I mean, it must have been lying there just watching us, and the damn thing just got up. It was like two blokes on each other's shoulders. It kept getting bigger and higher and higher. This thing was massive. Huge arms, thick legs, big head. We called him Cro-Magnon, you know. He had this big sloping forehead. The eyes were offset into the skull. It had a brownish, blackish face. It had, well, you wouldn't call it hair. You wouldn't call it fur. It was just hanging off his body about 2 or 3 inches long. And it just stood there and looked at us. We had our weapons, but I lowered mine and took the ammunition out. It was only blanks anyway. The other blokes saw me do this and they took their ammo out, and we became non-aggressive. Do you understand what I'm saying? It was just looking at us. The stance of it was aggressive at first, and when we did the less aggressive stance, it started to relax a little bit. We decided to walk off into the bush, and then it started paralleling us. We wanted to get out of this escarpment, and we turned our radio on and got a squelch. As soon as we did that, we got 3 rocks thrown at us. So we turned it back off, and then there was nothing. So we thought, okay, everything's fine. About an hour or so later, it was getting dark, and we could hear this thing again. We decided to sit down for the night and have some dinner. We could still hear it. We put our night vision goggles on so we could walk out, and we got about 50 meters in, and the damn thing popped out from behind a tree. All 3 of us saw it. This ended up going on for days. It kind of got used to us. It was sort of like a big kid playing peekaboo with us. It was snapping trees, and then sometimes it would thump its chest. Not aggressive, it was just playful. And then we started hiding behind trees and playing hide and seek, and the whole thing was a laughable event. We thought we could have been its next meal from the size of it. It could have just come out and ate us if it wanted to. I mean, this thing was huge. But every time we turned the radio on, the frequency seemed to make it a bit aggressive. It would start throwing things at us. It just didn't like the high frequency it was on. When we left the area, it broke a tree limb that we would have used a chainsaw on. It snapped it, and then it threw it. And when one of us urinated on a gum tree, it just bellowed its guts out at us. We were 4 days late getting back to where we were supposed to be, and when we got back there, we got chewed out by the RSN and the lieutenant that was waiting for us. When we told them what had happened, we were told to get in the rover. The major came over and made us swear that we saw nothing and we heard nothing, and that we were not to talk about this at all. Later, I was talking to a couple of other blokes a little bit higher up than what we were, and we found out from some other fellas in that unit that they'd all had similar things happen in this area in the Jameson Valley. They'd worked in there for nearly 10 years and then stopped it. Nobody was allowed to do exercises in there anymore. The Canunga training area up in Queensland is even more bizarre. They've seen them rummaging through the backs of rovers, trucks, and everything. There was a 14 by 11 tent, a 20-man tent, and a junior officer walked in, and there was one there going through the packs. That officer defecated himself, ran, and left his weapon in the tent. Back to the Jameson Valley, Yowie. I'm 6'4.5". If I put a bayonet on the top of my SLR and held it in the air, it would have touched this thing's chin. So as an estimate, I'm guessing this thing could be as tall as 11 feet. It had hair on the backs of its hands, and its hands were rubbery like combat gloves. The skin on the hands was darkish gray. The feet had hair on the top, but no hair on the bottom. Our feet, when we step on a log, our foot doesn't bend. Its foot molded around the log. Its heel was on the ground on one side, and its toes were on the ground on the other. It curled over like it was grabbing onto it as it walked over it. We saw all of this. And it rarely left tracks. It always stood on logs and rocks as it walked, so it didn't leave any tracks at all. You couldn't have fought this thing off. It was too big. And that's actually the end of the report. But whoever took the report left some further notes, and here's what he writes. The creature seemed to have facial expressions in the eyes when it played hide and seek, as though it was enjoying the games, possibly offering food at times and the same in return. It was a 5-day encounter overall. The main action was the first and fourth day. No real signs of aggression. Primal type flat nose. The nose moved when it smelled the air. It had black lips, wrinkled face, leathery hands, thick nails that were almost claw-like. A separate 6-toed print was later found, the rear toe like a primate. It made guttural noises starting low, rising to a high pitch at times. It shook its head when one man threw up. It's not considered to be an animal. It's almost childlike in personality at times. The pupils were like that of a diamond shape. It had dark eyes during the day and a reddish glow at night. It clanked rocks together, more than one at times. Further references regarding missing people and military ops are available. I just thought this was fascinating. This is a military group, sort of like our Rangers or, some recon outfit and one of the military branches doing a training exercise. And here's this Bigfoot, this Australian Bigfoot, tracking them the whole way. And they see it every day. And it seems to want to communicate with them and form some kind of rapport with these guys, or maybe it was just having fun. Either way, this is a fascinating account. So Yeti Dan, thank you very much for sending this. And again, this story was found on yowiehunters.net. I'll leave a link in the description below. You guys go over there and check out that website. I know they would appreciate it. Thank you all so much for clicking on this video and listening this far. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you, and I hope you all have a great weekend. And we'll see you on the next video. Thanks a lot.